to Maxed Out Man, helping you become the man you were made to be.
Hey guys, it's Kevin Davis from the Maxed Out Man podcast. It's episode number 41. I am here with Jim Young, which I'm super excited about. And actually, my wife said she was excited to listen to this one too. I'm going to kind of read a little bit of his bio. Jim is the author of Expansive Intimacy, How Tough Guys Defeat Burnout, which provides a roadmap out of the modern burnout lifestyle and BS, right? And into more expansive form of success that spans all aspects of life. Jim's work focuses on helping men and organizations create thriving, sustainable futures. He is also the host of the Expansive Intimacy podcast, a weekly conversation on the power of intimacy. And we'll put this in the show notes, but his website is thecenteredcoach.com. He is also a comedian, which I think is going to be fun and super interesting. I've always considered myself witty, but I am not funny. So that's the, I think there's a distinction there. You can kind of play off people, but it's a little bit difficult to actually be funny. So, hey, thanks for coming. I appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kevin. And I also don't consider myself funny. I just like to get into situations where fun might happen or funny might happen.
That's good. Those are the best, right? Like humor is a centered part of who I am personally, and I can't imagine not having that part of me.
Yeah,
so
life's too short.
So I did a quick little bio of you, but tell us more what you do, kind of what your philosophy and ideology is on this stuff and how you're helping men and, the women who love them kind of go through some of this stuff.
Yeah. In maybe a Brazil nut sized nutshell. I think that's the biggest nut. I don't know.
Yeah, probably is. And by the way, we have as much time as you need. So take your time and tell as much as you want.
I remember my grandmother always having those out at Thanksgiving. I'm like, what the hell are those? So my philosophy in general, so where I'll start is with this concept of expansive intimacy, which is a phrase that kind of came to me as I was navigating a pretty big life change. I'd gone through a 25-year corporate career, worked in leadership roles, kind of top of organizations, and burned out multiple times, and finally pulled the ripcord and said, I got to go find something else. And I discovered a career in coaching and facilitation and speaking and working with leadership teams. But I also discovered that what was going on for me when I was in burnout was this sense of isolation, this sense that I had to go it alone. I couldn't ask for help. I had to always be successful, no failure. And it just was too much. Like it just was not a good recipe for me. And I think it's not a good recipe for any of us to try and go through life with everything on our back. And what unwound it for me was when I started to really open myself up to other people and just share like what some of my struggles were, what some of my desires were, what some of the things I was excited about were, and be a little bit more creative. And I found that there were people, whether they were friends, whether they were, kind of reinvigorated relationships with my kids, even a really strong relationship I have with my ex-wife. I went through a divorce around that same time, a new romantic partner. What I've found is that by creating intimate connections in all areas of my life, that includes colleagues at work, that I don't have to carry that all on my back. I don't burn out, and I actually have so much fun, so much creativity, so much productivity. And, that's really, I guess that's my platform is, bring intimacy in every corner of your life, because that's what's going to, lead us to a long, successful, thriving life.
Do you think that, and let me just say, I think that most men, especially, and women, I think both, but we define intimacy almost always in a romantic or sexual way, right? So it's
Totally.
it's kind of like getting out of that mindset and realize that you can have real intimate relationships with other people, right? Other than your romantic partner. Is that kind of how you typically how would you define intimacy in the context of what you're doing?
That's a great point, Kevin. And that's one of the first things I usually talk about is that we say we hear the word intimacy and we think romantic sexual. Like that's the frame that we're in. And it's so much wider than that. I can have intimacy in a lot of different ways. I've heard you on some of your episodes. You talk about, being with your guy friends at an event, and that you say "I love you" to each other.
Yeah. Yep.
Right? There's a connection there. There's a closeness, and intimacy can take a lot of forms. It's one of the things I unpack in the book. Is we can have that sexual intimacy, and that's pinnacle experience, in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But I can also have physical intimacy that's not sexual, right? When my kids were little, having them sit on my lap reading a book was amazing. That's physical
Mm-hmm.
intimacy. It involves touch. I can have emotional intimacy. I can share with you, what's really going on underneath the surface, and let you see me, and let me see you, and all that. I can have experiential intimacy. We go out and we do stuff together. Intellectual intimacy. We get into a debate. All these different forms of connecting to a person and letting ourselves be seen, and letting people into what's going on for us. That creates intimate connection, and we feel closer. And you just know it when you feel it, right? And you can feel it anywhere. That's the big point, is it's not just with that one relationship.
Right. And it's interesting for me because I'm an evangelical Christian. And what's, people always talk about religion and you're a religious person. And for me, that intimate relationship is the way I usually try to explain that relationship that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is a spiritual intimacy that you can experience. My wife has this picture, which is basically Jesus hugging a man, like with the man's head on his chest.
Mm-hmm.
And that image, there's also this song called "We Danced," which is actually talking about this kind of intimate marriage dance at an event where you're dancing with Jesus. And it's like, dude, I mean, I get kind of goosebumpy now because that song, and like I'm saying, as a guy, like this is Jesus, a big burly man who, if you look historically, this is not Michelangelo's blonde girly Jesus.
Emaciated.
Yeah. Right. But like it's that intimacy and that vision that I have spiritually that really, for me can define what those relationships look like.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned spiritual, because that's another form of intimacy. And for you as a Christian, and I grew up in a Catholic household. I've explored different spiritual paths over the years. Now, and it's one of the great ways that we can connect with something bigger than ourselves, and we can feel like, oh, I'm part of this. I'm connected in a really, really deep way from my soul. And one of the examples I give actually is, kind of from the secular world. I talk about improv comedy as a spiritual experience of a type, right? That we have 60 people showing up in the audience. We got all our performers on stage. We got the staff in the theater. It's 70 or so people coming to one place for the purpose of lifting our spirits, to be together in laughter, to be connected in this way that transcends kind of the everyday. And so there's a lot of forms of spiritual connection that I think are part of how we access intimacy. And that can be through a belief system like Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism, or it could be through being out in nature on a hike with a group of your buddies, or being at the comedy theater.
Yeah. And that, it's kind of funny because I never actually thought about it until you just said that. But if you think about improv comedy, right, it's not just an intellectual experience to where you say something, I say something funny, I come up. That's not an intellectual, because and I'm not an improv guy, but like I was saying before we started, I consider myself kind of witty, but not necessarily stand up and be funny. Yeah. But it's that you have to have that underpinning of connection emotionally and mentally that play off each other, right? Like that's how I would, and like I said, I'm not deep into the improv world, but that connection seems like what drives the funny and drives the entertainment.
It totally does. Our best shows are when we, as our director often encourages us, is we bring an emotional point of view into our scenes. And we really connect with our scene partner. That's a lot of where I learned intimacy, actually, is on the improv stage and in improv classes, which I've been studying that form of arts for almost 10 years. And a lot of like, how do I relate to people? How do I show myself? How do I take risks to be true to what's actually I feel inside. And sometimes I could, practice that on the improv stage. I'd be like, oh, this situation makes me, brings up I think there's a feeling of I'm sad. And so I'm going to play a sad character, and it let me try things on. I think that's important in any relationship skill that we're building in building intimacy is we got to take risks. We got to play some cards and reveal what's going on.
And what are those risks, right? Because we all, we can define risks in different ways because, we all come from a different place. So what kind of risks are you talking about taking?
A couple jump straight to mind. One is around sharing desires. I think it's a word that we, again, sexualize. A desire often gets brought into the bedroom. But I've got a lot of desires in my life. I have desires for, what kind of work I do. I have desires for, activities that I want to do. And some of those don't feel like I should do them. They don't fit the archetype of what I'm supposed to be like in the world. And so sharing my desires is one way, but also, emotions, if we come back to that, like that's a risk. When I share with somebody that I'm feeling scared, right? I'm a guy. I'm not supposed to feel scared.
Rub some dirt in it, put your big girl panties on.
That's weak, right? And it's also just true, right? Emotions are not, they're just part of the human experience, right? And for 40 years of my life, I stuffed all that stuff that didn't feel like it fit in the man box down. And I said, I'm not going to be, worried or afraid or sad or any of these things. And I'm trying to hold in all this grief and all this concern and all this worry, and it ate me up. And when I started to take the risks and I had to find places where it was safe to take the risks. And, that's really important. You can't just go tell everybody how you're feeling because it might get weaponized and used against you. Yeah. But you find that person that you trust, and maybe it's your cousin or your best buddy or your therapist or your minister or whoever, who you can just talk to, and they're not going to judge you. They're just going to let you have whatever feeling you're having. Starting to build that muscle and taking that risk and say like, yeah, I'm worried that I'm not making enough money to get my kids college paid for, and I'm going to let them down. I'm going to feel like a failure. Like that's a big feeling.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, that's good.
I was going to say, I've been working with a business coach who I have multiple brands and multiple businesses. This is one of them. But he's also a friend of mine, but we're not, we haven't known each other that long, but he's one of the guys where when I'm going somewhere and we're in an event, he lives in Philadelphia. I live in Montana. I'll say, hey, give him he's a great hugger. We always talk about him being an amazing hugger. And what's funny is I'm 6 foot, he's 6'4". So when I hug him, I do put my head on his chest kind of a thing. But it's interesting because this last week was a challenging week. I didn't get a lot of sleep. I had to travel over the weekend to North Carolina and back and in like 2 days. And I'm feeling some pressure financially on some of my business deals and all that. And so I basically emailed him and said, hey, I know we're having a meeting and this is kind of where I'm at. And I'm expressing to him my anxiety, the worry, the tiredness, the fatigue, and all of those things. And so that laid out this, it's like, yeah, we're talking about revenue and sales and building networks and all that kind of stuff. But this underpinning of, hey, what's going on with you personally in the context of these business deals?
Yeah, that's the undercurrent, and if we're growing as individuals, if we're trying to achieve things, we're going to run into challenges. We're going to have low energy. We're going to have doubts. We're going to, run into problems that we got to solve that we can't solve on our own. And that's going to impact us. And I think it's so critical to have that person or those people. And I like to think of it as a group of people. That's part of the idea with expansive intimacy. I've got people all across my life. No matter what the issue is, I have some place to go with it, and oftentimes multiple places to go with it to say, yeah, man, this contract that I'm waiting on that's going to make a big difference. Like, I don't know what's going on. I haven't heard back. I'm freaking out. and have somebody just be there to, be with me in that anxious moment of saying like, hey, I see that sounds really stressful. Sometimes it's all I need is for somebody to be like, yeah, of course you'd be stressed out.
Yeah. And then maybe give you a little bit of background on them. Do you find that you're compartmentalizing, and not in a negative way? What I mean is you have one particular set of friends or groups of people that kind of are in this quote unquote box to say, okay, well, when I'm talking about contracts and business deals, it's kind of this. When I'm talking about my relationship with my kids or my ex-wife, it's this. Is that, is that something that you do?
I'd say definitely at first, as I was starting to grow my ability to have more open, honest relationships with people. Nowadays, I have so many people that are kind of in that trusted advisor category for me that I have outlets. I mean, I talk to my romantic partner a lot about my business. And I also I've got a men's group that I meet with once a month, guys from all over the country, a couple in Canada. We meet once a month and we talk about everything. And my improv teammates, we get together for rehearsal, and yeah, improv people rehearse. Well, oftentimes we just get together and we start talking about life and like what's going on with parenting or what's going on with our work. And it's such a relief because on a day-to-day basis, almost no matter who I am interacting with, I can just be like, hey, this is what's going on for me today. And it's such a relief. Like I don't have to be alone with any of it. And I get tons of resources. I get ideas that I would never have, as I'm able to share those, those feelings or those worries or whatever's going on.
And it feels like that. I mean, obviously you're the quote unquote expert in this field, but it feels like just having those relationships brings up, we talk about, rising tide lifts all ships, right? Like having you pursue those intimate relationships with these other people, I would guess actually raises the bar for, and opens channels for all of those people in your lives too.
I hope so. And I trust that. And I also know that I've been really leaning into intimacy as a skill set for about 2.5 years. And I wrote a book on it. I do a weekly podcast on it. And that's so I can continue learning. Like, I feel like I've scratched the surface even still. And that there's so much for me to learn. I learn in relationship. I learn who I am in relationship. I learn what I'm capable of. I learn, about the things that are outside of my purview. Like I haven't understood yet because other people can see it. Yeah.
This may be too personal a question, but I'm curious and like you said, you have a great relationship with your ex, but had this work been done earlier in your life, do you feel like that would have impacted how that relationship progressed? I don't know the whole situation obviously, but
I absolutely think that it would have, because one phrase I would use is I was emotionally immature. I didn't know how to be honest about what was going on inside me. And so I shut down and I made myself unavailable in certain ways that were really frustrating to her. And she had different ways that she responded to the world that were frustrating to me. And I think we both could have used some work. I think part of why we have a really healthy, ultimately the best relationship we've ever been in, including, when we first met, is because we've both done a ton of work to realize what are the things that we trip over regularly in life? What gets us into this anxious place or this fight, flight, freeze kind of response, instead of taking a breath, checking out everybody's perspectives, having a mature conversation, being willing to be wrong, having some humility. Neither one of us had done that work. And I put my hand up high for not having done any of that work and kind of going through life pretty ignorantly. And the divorce was a big slap in the face. It was a big wake up call. And I could have gone in two directions. I could have dug deeper and been in that hole, or I could have said, all right, I'm going to climb out. And, inch by inch, I think I did. And now I get to climb the mountain inch by inch.
Right.
Every day it requires work.
Yeah, I've been married for 28 years. And
Wow,
it's
congratulations.
definitely something.
That's
Thank
impressive.
you. Yeah. And it's a miracle she hasn't killed me in my sleep, because we watch a lot of Dateline. So, if any of my audience is listening and I just stop doing podcasts, please do a wellness check or something on me. But, they joke, because she's the most demure, like just a beautiful, nice, like the nicest person in the room, way nicer and more interesting than I am. But she's a baker also. She has this poster in her kitchen that says baking because murder is wrong. So there's this whole underpinning with her friends that are like, she's secretly a serial killer. But all that to say, like, we have worked really, really hard, because I'm not necessarily the most emotionally available person. I grew up with a crazy childhood, kind of started raising myself early, and my parents are alcoholics and all that stuff. And so, I didn't necessarily learn that. So my feelings, I got really good at shoving all that stuff down, and, making ourselves emotionally available to each other has really been a process over these 28 years, which that's a long time. But I say this, it literally is better every single day. And that's awesome.
I've learned so much from my romantic partner. We've been together for about 3 years. And what I've learned from her is that I can, in a trusted relationship like that, which it sounds like you and your wife have, where you can step forward and you can do the uncomfortable thing, and you don't have to get it right the first time. You keep coming back, and you're committed to each other's growth and each other's, spirits growing. That's one of my favorite definitions of love is, supporting each other's and our own spiritual growth. And that process of coming back and learning each time and not having to get it right has been so soothing for me. It's allowed me to grow in ways that I didn't think were, I didn't even understand were possible. I totally understand, especially what you said about upbringing. I think a lot of us shut down that emotional honesty because it wasn't safe really early on. I grew up in a chaotic household as well, a lot of alcoholism in my family. And some of the work that I did to help with my healing starting about 10 years ago was to do some 12-step work in the Al-Anon program for friends and family members of alcoholics. And that's one of the first places where I found safety, where I could just share what was going on and I could hear people doing the same. I saw it modeled and I was like, oh, wow. Like, I remember going to the first meeting and hearing people share it. And I'm like, have they been reading my mail? Like, how do they know this story? And it's so common. I was like, oh, this is common. I'm not completely unique here. I've just lived an experience that other people have, and there's a way through it.
Yeah, that's I've never done those kind of programs. I kind of went and I went from stuffing things down to just kind of like, I'm a very logistical kind of problem solving kind of guy. So I approached it from a logistical, quote unquote logical sense, but allowed me to process those emotions and kind of, come either not necessarily stuff them down, but leave certain things behind to say, okay, well, I've dealt with that. I feel okay with that. I'm at peace with that, and then move on. But yeah, it's an interesting, because I think people, and it's funny that you say that all those people share that experience, because I think overall, when you look at these different experiences, there's such a commonality in them versus like, I'm the only one that is facing this, right? We're all humans. We all have the same basic makeup. Experientially it's different, but yeah, it's usually not surprising when you're like, oh, all these 30 people are feeling the exact same way that I have.
Yeah, the details of it look different, but the shape of it's the same. And one of the things I discovered when I was writing my book, I was writing about burnout, my experience of that as a man, and how it felt really vulnerable to share anything about burnout. And what I discovered in the writing process was that shame played a huge role. And I think that I just heard that in what you were talking about is like, we're not supposed to feel a certain way. We're not supposed to, we're terminally unique, and like there's something defective about us. And when we look around and we see the shared experience of so many other people matches what ours is like, it's like, oh, like I'm not bad or wrong or defective. I just went through some experiences that were really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And then, being able to share about that, like being able to connect with other people who've had that experience, to me, that's what helped me get through some shame that I had around feeling like I failed. And I tried to succeed. And I got to the top of the ladder. I was the president of a tech company and I burned out. And I felt shame around that. I'm like, I couldn't handle it. I'm not man enough. And then I started to realize, like, okay, there's a lot that went into that. And as I started to unpack that and started to connect with other people who had similar stories, I was like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me.
Yeah.
That just wasn't the right job for me, the right environment for me. I wasn't ready for it. I had work to do. And I could start to move forward.
Can you, on that note, can you describe, because the way I would describe burnout may not be the same way you would describe burnout. And I think everybody, and just, words have different meanings to different people,
Yep.
And I worked in the corporate environment before I started my first business in like 25 years ago. But so I can put it in that context of the corporate world. But how do you define burnout and help people define burnout in their own terms?
The World Health Organization put a formal definition into the ICD-11 back in 2019, International Classification of Diseases, where they defined burnout finally, and it had been studied for 50 years before that, as a chronic condition of unmanaged stress that leads to three core symptoms. Exhaustion, and that's often multifaceted. Emotional exhaustion is often the way they describe it, but it can be physical, mental, spiritual. Cynicism, or a kind of a lack of belief, disconnection, and then a feeling that you're just not getting it done anymore. They call it a lack of professional efficacy. You kind of lost some zip on your fastball, if you're a sports fan. Like I'm just not able to work at capacity. And so those three symptoms, when those are present, over a period of time too, it's chronic. It's not, I hear the term burnout thrown around loosely, like, yeah, I was feeling a little burned out yesterday. Not really. You were having a stressful day. You were exhausted or whatever was going on. But I think it's gotten used a little too loosely at times, because I think at any given time, there's probably 10 or 15% of the workforce or the population that are in actual burnout. There are other people who are along a spectrum who maybe have two of those three symptoms going on, or one of those three symptoms going on. They're at risk for burnout. And the numbers on that, by various estimates, are anywhere from 50% of the population is somewhere on that risk spectrum to, I've seen some wild numbers like 75, 80%. The studies, the surveys that come up with those numbers are sometimes debatable, but yeah, burnout is a scientifically studied phenomenon. It's clear what it is, and it just affects a ton of people. And it's getting worse every year. I think the numbers of people who are in that high risk or actually in it bucket, year over year, according to one of the studies that I look at the most, has gone from like 30 to 35 to like 38 over the last 3 years. So the conditions that are out there for people in the working world and in the world in general are leading to those symptoms being pretty prevalent.
Wow. Yeah, there's a physiological component, and I don't know if they've studied this, but cortisol, which is the stress hormone, which is why, if you're carrying a bunch of extra fat on your body, in particular around your midsection, that typically is a cortisol response. And is there my estimation would be that it's not sustainable for very long. Like, how long do most people is there an epiphany? Is there like, this person had a heart attack, or this person lost their job or their marriage or whatever? Like, is there a particular epiphany that people go through that are like, wait a minute, this is not right. I need to take steps to fix this?
In my experience, and one of the things that I coach around very specifically, is burnout.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you're enjoying it and learning a lot. If you're looking for extra help, don't forget that I do offer one-on-one coaching. We can talk through a ton of different issues. I can give you guides, guidelines, and logistical help to help you take that next step or go to that next level in some of the things that you're dealing with in your life. We also have some course content, some guides, and a lot of educational materials over at maxedoutman.com. For the coaching, go ahead and go to maxedoutman.com/coaching, and you can learn about that. And then just go to maxedoutman.com for everything else. Thanks for joining us. Now back to the episode.
Is that people don't come to me saying, hey, I think I might be on the burnout spectrum. I'm at risk of burning out. It's, I've burned out. And you've just named a few of the events that can happen. There are physiological events. There are links between burnout related stress and cardiovascular events. So prevalence of heart attacks, depression, anxiety, divorce, addiction. At the very far end, worst end of the spectrum is suicide. Mm-hmm. As with any other mental health condition, there's going to be a lot of different effects. It's going to affect your body. I mean, you might feel it as, chronic headaches because you have tension in your jaw because you're carrying so much stress. There's a lot of different markers and signs. And I think the threshold moment's going to be different for each person. How resilient somebody is, how willing they are to ask for help, that sort of thing. But what I've found is most typically that when we're talking about burnout, it's not about prevention, it's about recovery. People don't say I need help until they've kind of crashed and burned. And that's my story. Like that's exactly the experience I went through. And part of the work that I try to do when I'm working in organizations, helping build cultures, is to try and burnout proof from the organizational perspective that we're not creating conditions that are likely to cause people to burn out. And to just hit one other point on that is that it's not that workplaces are the sole cause of burnout. That's one of the fallacies that's out there that I love to debunk because it points the finger at like, it's my boss's problem. It's the company's problem. They're causing this. Having particular beliefs, being a people pleaser, having low self-esteem, being a perfectionist, those are also personal risk factors that can lead people into burnout because they can never do enough. And I had some of those going on as well. So it wasn't just the workplaces I was in. It was also, I was a perfectionist because I felt like I could never get anything wrong. And I was trying to keep everybody happy. Right? Yeah. It's a terrible recipe for any kind of serenity.
Yeah. And it's interesting because burnout is not, so you kind of look at these in like the symptom bucket versus the root cause bucket. And so we may think, well, the reason this guy or girl doesn't like their job is because they're depressed and they have clinical depression. Let's put them on SSRIs and, do all these things. Or the reason this person's overweight is because they're depressed or what. But if you it's like what, and this is one of the problems I think we have in the medical community is that so no one asks the question, what's your life look like? Like, what's your relationships look like? What does your work environment look like? And all those to try to come to that root cause. So it's like this dichotomy of you think that, the depression is the problem, but it's actually this overdrive and this burnout that's the problem.
Right. And actually, one of the biggest things that I learned as I was researching burnout for writing the book is a former MD by the name of Dyke Drummond, and he's done a ton of work in the healthcare industry where burnout is rampant. And he had a paper that I was reading where he said something really provocative. He said, burnout is not a problem. And I was like, how is that? And he went on to explain that problems have solutions. If I get a flat tire, I can call AAA. I can go get the spare out of my trunk. 30 minutes later, I'm back on the road. Problem solved. Burnout does not have a single silver bullet solution because it's not a problem. It's a dilemma. And dilemmas have multiple causes, as you were just describing. And so instead of a solution, what we need is a set of strategies, which is exactly why I got to intimacy, because intimacy, as we were talking before, has all these different permutations, and it's about getting the resources and the support that you need for those times when you don't know. So, somebody who has, an eating disorder, well, one of the resources they might need might be a friend group where they can share about how their stress causes them to eat. And maybe they also need a diet coach and they need a trainer. Like we need all these, multifaceted solutions to be fully healthy as people. Like, I mean, ultimately it's like, if I take burnout off of the table, I need a lot of things in my life to feel at my best. I need spiritual connection. I need physical connection. I need, spaces to play and have fun. I need a well-rounded life. And that's a lot of what I think intimacy can provide, and it can help us deal with conditions like burnout and other things that are complex like that.
Yeah, I'm kind of a logistical guy, like I said. So I'm curious, like if I'm where, as you begin to go up this burnout mountain, what, as a person, how do I start to say, hey, maybe this is a problem? And then what steps are you recommending as a coach to kind of begin to, diversify into different paths? Let's put our foot on this path and not this one in particular.
Sure.
How do you walk people through that?
I'll just start with a couple simple things. First is physically, how are you doing? Right? Do you feel vital and robust? Are you sleeping well? Do you have pain in your body? Right? Because a lot of that is symptoms of stress. We carry stress physically in our bodies, and that could be a sign that, okay, I'm climbing that burnout mountain. The other thing that I like to do is just ask the simple question, which I don't think we get asked nearly enough, and I don't think we answer it honestly nearly enough, is what do you want? And ask that question across your life. Like, do you want the job you're in? Do you want the social life that you have? Do you want, the experience that you're living? How well are you achieving the things that you want? And if you're not, then start to look at what's holding you back. Because if you're not getting what you want, if you're not living inside the things that you value, you're creating stress in your life. You're having to manage every day. You're dreading what the next day holds. You're, on Sunday, you're starting to worry about, I got to go to work tomorrow, right? Pay attention to those signs. And I think it's so easy to get stuck in this rut that says like, well, I just got to do what I got to do, right? I got a mortgage, I got kids, and like, yeah, absolutely. I get it, right? And I say this from a guy who walked into his boss's office and quit a 6-figure job with no plan 6 years ago because I couldn't do it anymore. Now, I won't recommend that approach, but
sometimes that's the first, you got to take the leap, right?
Yeah. So it's about taking risks, and there's a lot of different ways to make that move. But if you realize like, okay, if I did this, if I kept this life going for the next 5 years, 10 years, what would it look like? What would the quality of my life be like? And if you're not happy with that answer, start to figure out the change.
Yeah.
And I would say, work with somebody. And it doesn't have to be somebody that you pay like a coach, although coaches can be, as you know, incredibly powerful resources. It could be a therapist. It could be, a peer group. But get outside of your own head, get some other perspectives. Because I know when I tried to first make a move out of burnout, I tried to do it on my own. And I started a failed business. I couldn't sustain it. I went back into a corporate job that burned me out again. And I finally said, okay, I'm going to do it with some help this time. I'm going to get the resources that I need. And it's launched me into something that I love to do every day.
Isn't that funny how we will go, and this is, I think this defines addiction too, but we go back to things that we know are not good for us because it's more comfortable to be in the bad part of that than it is to feel comfortable in the risk and the unknowns.
It's avoidance, it's denial. It's, this isn't, I'll just have it this one more time. I'll just have that ice cream sundae, or I'll have the whiskey, or whatever it is that might draw you in. And it's numbing out. It's staying away from the pain. And every time I've gone through the pain, and it's not to say I don't still avoid stuff, right?
Oh yeah.
But the lesson that I've learned over the years is every time I go through that scary looking door, I get surprised on the other side. I find some kind of growth that I didn't expect. And now it's not even scary anymore. It's like, I've got a formula that I live by, and I prescribe it to one of my 2 primary improv teachers, and they both deny that they taught me this, but whatever. Scary plus interesting equals growth. Something that feels a little bit scary, but there's something interesting about like, what would happen if I did that? There's growth. There's going to be growth on the other side of that. And so when I can see that combination, I'm like, all right, let's go, buckle up.
Yeah. That's really cool. Scary plus interesting equals growth. I like that. I like that a lot. And what you were talking about before is something I talk a ton about, which is how you define success. I actually have on over my shoulder, Success Redefined is one of kind of my posters. I've got a t-shirt and all that stuff. But, it's like, how are you defining what success looks like to you and in your life? And I think so many times, we call it the rat race, or, trying to climb the corporate ladder or be successful in your business. If you're defining that around either accolades or money or, drive and all of those things, there's never enough of those things to be satisfied.
Right.
And I talk about using money. Money's a tool. Money's, when you don't have any money, it sucks. So money, but
a certain amount we need.
Yeah. And we talked about, I was on a podcast yesterday. We talked about Bill Gates's wife and how he had been around her and she was just miserable. She was just a miserable person. So there's no money is terrible, but a way too much money can also be terrible because then you don't know how to define those things. But defining success and using money to build your life, I think, is something that can be hugely impactful and really defining that for yourself.
I totally agree. Any of those status-based measures of success are bound for failure because it becomes a comparison game and it's never ending. I remember somebody telling me a story about, it was the wealthiest man in, it's one of the Nordic countries. I don't remember if it was Sweden or whatever, but he had a personal wealth valuation of like $3 billion. And something happened with his investments where he lost a bunch of his wealth, and he was now like the second or third wealthiest person in the country. He stepped in front of a train, committed suicide.
Oh yeah, I remember that story.
Right? Like, you can never win that game. And the study I often point to, because I think of, success and happiness, I think have some correlation. The Harvard study of adult development, which is the longest running study on human happiness. It's been going on for about 80 years. Some of the original participants are still alive and they get surveyed every year. They've studied this group and they've expanded it over the years to their descendants or their family members. As they've looked at this data, they've cataloged what are the factors for a long, healthy, happy life, or as they refer to them, happy, well elders. And some of them are you'd expect, right? Exercise, have a spiritual practice, don't smoke, drink moderately. The number one factor, if you could only do one of the 7 things that they prescribe, is to have close, connected relationships.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you're enjoying it and learning a lot. If you're looking for extra help, don't forget that I do offer one-on-one coaching. We can talk through a ton of different issues. I can give you guides, guidelines, and logistical help to help you take that next step or go to that next level in some of the things that you're dealing with in your life. We also have some course content, some guides, and a lot of educational materials over at maxedoutman.com. For the coaching, go ahead and go to maxedoutman.com/coaching, and you can learn about that. And then just go to maxedoutman.com for everything else. Thanks for joining us. Now back to the episode.
Or intimacy. That is what sustains us, is the people in our lives. And you hear about it when somebody leaves a job and they quit or they got fired or whatever. I'd say, what do you miss about it? The people. That's why we're here, is to connect with other people. And so if we lean into that, into intimacy, I think what it does for us is it helps us get to happiness. It helps us get to success.
Yeah, and it seems like over the last, obviously with the pandemic and all that kind of stuff, with what depending on how you look at it, forced isolation. And looking at the data, it seems like that isolation part of it and that lack of human interaction is so bad right now. And I feel like as a society, it's hard to imagine how we turn that around.
Yeah, I think it's going to require people to take risks of different types because some of those social skills have atrophied. I've got kids who are 15, 18, and 20. And so they were, in high school or middle school when the lockdown period happened at a critical time in their social development. And, what I've had to encourage them to do is continue to put yourself out there. You're not going to know how to do it. Do it anyway. And you're going to figure it out on the fly. It's a little bit like improv. We have a tenet in improv that says follow your foot, which means, if you're on the side of the stage and there's, some other scene going on and you feel like you get your body says like, oh, I think I should go into this scene, but I don't know, my head doesn't know how. Just follow your foot and then figure out what's going to happen once you get there and trust that you already have everything that you need. You just got to take a risk.
Yeah, and that recovery period is going to be interesting. I'm not, especially for the really younger children that missed out on all that. My kids are 25 and 23, so it was a little bit different because they were already out of that. But yeah, that's it. Taking that risk and not being afraid to fail is something that they definitely need to do. If you're, and I want to be respectful of your time, but if you're looking at, if I'm the average person, I feel like I'm doing, kind of like we talked about earlier, we're kind of ready to step off of the mountain or stop moving towards that burnout mountain. What are the first steps? And I ask this kind of, I've had many guests where we talk about getting out of isolation and building relationships and all that. What are your advice? What's your advice on how to begin this process to do that expansive intimacy, right? Like begin to build those relationships slowly. How do you prescribe that, for lack of a better term?
For men in particular, the first thing I would say is figure out the activity that you love, whether that's bowling or archery or hiking or playing cards, and find a group of guys that are interested in the same thing. Because as men, we're conditioned to socialize shoulder to shoulder in activities. We don't go to a cafe and sit down and pour out our hearts to each other. I think women are more adept at that.
Yeah.
Right. So take it slow and do something that already feels fun to you. And don't expect on that first time that you're going to, develop a blood brother, but just keep committing to that and put it on the calendar. I've got a guy I met a couple of years ago. He lives out in Chicago. We just get on a call about once a month. And one of the keys to that relationship is we put it on the calendar and we know like we're going to talk or he's going to, geek out about music or he's a musician and find that common thread that gets you talking about low stakes and then start to take a little bit of a risk. If you start to kind of get that feeling of like, hey, it's got this urge to let this guy know that I think he's really cool and I'd like to hang out with him again. And I'd like to, share about, my work or whatever it is, just start growing that circle a little bit each time. Take small risks. And once you've done that enough times, you're going to realize like, okay, this guy sees me and he gets me and he thinks I'm a good person. So I can kind of share more with him. And, just one of the things that I learned in my 12-step work in Al-Anon is the 1 day at a time principle. We've all seen the bumper stickers or wherever else we've seen it. It's there for a reason. We do one little thing every day. James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits, says this as well. Small changes repeated every day get us where we want to go. So if you feel like, I want to have more friends, I want a better social life, I want to have a better romantic life, find what's the little thing you can do each day. If it's in your romantic life, write a little note to your sweetheart in the morning, leave it on the counter. It doesn't have to be some big grand gesture. Be like, hey, thinking of you, hoping you're having a great day.
Yeah.
And see what that builds. And then just keep building. Have fun with it.
Yeah, it's funny. And I think I've told this story before, but I actually did that for an entire year. I took a 3x5 card and wrote, it's, what I love about you. And I started taping it around her mirror in our master bathroom. And by the end of that year, you can imagine 365 of those.
Yeah.
But that was something that, you know, I actually had to be deliberate.
Sweet, but I can't actually see myself in the mirror.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. She, you know, luckily our bathroom is a decent size. So she had room to do that. But then I took it and put it in a book. I did like a Shutterfly type book, threw some pictures in there, but I was deliberate about it. Like I actually got an Excel spreadsheet and I sat down every couple of weeks and I listed 10 or 11 things, you know, and then used that, you know, it's not like I was every morning sitting in the sunshine, writing these eloquent things. Like I was deliberate about it, but I love what you say about this shoulder to shoulder idea, because a lot of times we talk about isolation, we talk about intimacy, we talk about building better male to male relationships. And a lot of time it's like, well, that's a bunch of woo woo and I've got to go pour my heart out for people. And I had this discussion with somebody the other day, and they were a little bit disagreeable about the fact that men's relationships are built around activity. Like that's just how we work. Because I was having the discussion that I have a difficult time where I live because I'm not really a hunter, you know, and I live in rural Montana, which this time of year, everybody's hunting widow. All the wives are hunting widows right now because they're all gone. Well, I don't like hunting. It's not my thing. I'm a car guy. Yeah. I build hot rods and do Jeep stuff and, you know, entrepreneurial stuff. And so I have a very small local relationship pool, so to speak, activity wise. But it, you know, going out and being able to find that, you know, is something that's super important. So like if there's a car show, I can go out and do that. Or if I meet somebody that likes cars, I can actually bring them out to my shop or like you're saying, learn playing golf and going to different, if you're an entrepreneur, going to those kind of meetings or any of those things, right? Like that's where it starts.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And sometimes it does take some creativity, and sometimes it's like, all right, you know what, I'm going to check out something new that I don't do. It could be so many things. You know, if you're a microbrewery geek, you know, go out and belly up to the bar and sit next to somebody like, hey, what are you drinking?
Yeah.
You know? I think if we just allow ourselves to be creative and kind of follow the fun, follow like what's interesting to us, then, you know, we open up a lot of possibilities, and, you know, just make that move, see what happens.
Yeah. Take that risk, right? That's the big important thing for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a great place to kind of wrap up. If people want to learn, you know, obviously your book, your podcast, where do we find all this? And I'll put more of these in the show notes also, but kind of guide us through that.
Sure. Really, everything can be found via my website, thecenteredcoach.com. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. The podcast releases every week, and there's a link on the website for that. My book is there as well. So yeah, really anything that people want to find out about me can kind of go through that one channel.
Awesome. All right, Jim. Well, I appreciate your time, man. I think this is super helpful, and hopefully we'll encourage some people that are facing, you know, even if they're in early stages of burnout, to go and, you know, start taking steps to step off that mountain and, you know, look at more ways for expansive intimacy. Right.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on the show, Kevin. I really appreciate being in the conversation.
All right. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Cheers.
If you're looking to really maximize your life and become the man you were made to be, head over to maxedoutman.com and get your journey started today.